When League of Legends first released, the idea of rules or a meta didn't exist both in the minds of the community and at Riot, where the idea of a jungler, carry, or support didn't exist and people kinda just picked what champion looked cool and went down an open lane, with the only generally accepted idea being a 2-1-2 strategy. And a product of this mindset was that champions ended up being designed for more of a general, non-specific purpose, or rather than designing Soraka specifically for bot lane and as a support, she was designed in a way where she could go anywhere. For example, Soraka as a battle mage was not only quite common to see, but also pretty good because her old Q had really good fighting presence with its highly spammable consistent damage and MR shred, as well as the fact that you used to be able to cast W on yourself and that it used to provide resistances to the target so you could be deceptively tanky. But as time went on and people became more familiar with how the game worked, that old idea of a 2-1-2 meta, where both dual lanes were fighting for CS, was pretty quickly iterated on by the players. For example, the jungle and how they realized it was possible to farm as a normal role rather than the difficult extra resource that laners could try to get that Riot originally imagined it as, which not only meant the jungler had a whole new source of golden EXP, but also meant that one of the dual lanes could then earn solo golden EXP, which was a massive benefit and quickly became the meta to the more experienced players. Another was the carry and support dynamic, where they realized that rather than trying to fight or ration the minions among two people, it was far more efficient for one player to take all of the minions, while the other player picked a champion who could do fairly well without needing gold for items, which is why tanks are seen as a supportive class, because CC doesn't have any scalings that require items, meaning a 0-item Leona R is just as good as a 5-item Leona R, as well as the fact that the ability to take more hits before dying let them be a frontliner for the person who's taking all the CS. Same with Enchanters, where because their supportive effects were able to be cast on allies, it meant that you could essentially transfer some of your power to the carry so that they could win the game much more easily. And this new meta of one top, one mid, one jungler, and the carry support bot ended up being absolutely incredible for the game for many reasons. For example, how each role was completely unique to one another, and it ended up casting a wide net for all different types of players who enjoy different things. But one of the most important benefits was that Riot could now use that as a baseline for how the game should be played going forward, and start to polish up the game based on that idea. For example, to support gold income items that help supports actually get items over the course of the game, the jungle items that let players stray away from the 5 health potion start and let them tune the jungle a bit better, and so much more. And of course, this then happened to the champion kits, where with that new idea of how the game should be played, they could then do things like balance a mid laner specifically for mid lane, or a jungler specifically for the jungle, as well as create and rework champions for a purpose, rather than needing to have those weird aspects to them like Soraka's battle mage aspects, instead pushing that unused power into a more specific purpose. And while that sounds great and all, meaning that champions could be more fun by having more tools in their kit for that intended playstyle, this new idea came with 3 significant downsides that are the main subject of today's video. First was that by aligning champions to a specific purpose, rather than letting them be more open-ended, it pushed a ton of power into the game, because rather than having each champion have 100% power budget, and depending on how you want to play, you could really only use like 80%, it now meant that since you only have one real way to play, that one way is now using 100% of the power budget, with those weird extra variables using up part of the power budget being removed entirely. Second was that it put a pretty severe restriction on player creativity with how you can interact with the kits, because rather than giving a player a blank canvas they could use to fit to their own playstyle, the champions now came with preloaded playstyles that you can really only ever use in one way, which also heavily contributed to the feeling where trying to play off meta is a lot less fun because of how much power difference there is, where trying to play Taric top nowadays sees you getting curb stomped by the player who's playing meta, because not only are champions stronger overall, but since champions have less power in their off meta, it creates a more drastic fluctuation in power between off meta and meta. And then thirdly is the relation to the item system, where rather than champions being a blank canvas and the item system taking on more of the class design of being able to morph your champion into how you like to play, the champions coming preloaded with everything they need means that the item system ends up being worth less. And I know a large portion of players only got into League in the past few years, so what I'm saying might sound a bit weird, so let me explain. Assassins as we know them today were simply just fighters back in the day. Akali, for example, had the theme of a ninja assassin, but because of the general game state and idea of a more open-ended champions, it meant that her gameplay was inherently tied to more of an identity of a fighter. For example, her Shroud, and how it not only used to provide a ton of survivability by literally preventing the enemy from being able to attack you in a similar way to Teemo Blind or Jack's Counter-Strike, but that it also used to provide armor and MR when she was inside, very similarly to how Gwen's W works, which made her very tanky when inside. Same with her old passive that provided a deceptively high amount of survivability through the healing, which then paired very well with her spammable Q and E for consistent damage-based healing, or how her Q would restore energy when she procced it to give her that drawn-out fight power that fighters needed for the consistent damage. What this meant was that while yes, you could spec into that assassin side of Akali, not only did you have less burst and mobility in favor of more consistent damage and survivability, which made it harder to one-shot people, but it also meant that going for a more sustained damage-based fighter build was just as viable because she had aspects of her kit that supported that playstyle due to the open-ended design, rather than what we saw after her assassinification, where they front-loaded most of the power into burst with longer cooldowns and took away her resistances. And this is what happened to most of the champions during the infamous Assassin update, where the main purpose was to essentially just make them less able to spec into the playstyle of a fighter in favor of making them better at that Assassin playstyle by condensing their power more specifically into burst. Fist W was changed from a simple activatable on-hit effect to having the active burst damage portion on the first hit, as well as his ult gaining increased damage based on how far it was thrown, which was essentially just a significant damage buff. Kha'Zix's passive was buffed to have much better damage, his Q was made less consistent in favor of more damage, his W no longer slowed enemies pre-evolution, which just like Akali's old Shroud was crucial for melee champions back in the day to stick to people for the consistency, and his ult was given that brush-based invisibility passive that tried to enforce that assassin who hunts their prey type of theme, which was an absurd amount of mobility that broke the game until it was removed. Katarina lost her on-hit from W, the damage reduction from her E nerfed significantly, and her Q going from AD to AP due to AP being more of a burst-oriented stat that was great for assassins. And the same applies to tanks as well, where unlike assassins who had their damage front-loaded into burst and made less consistent, tanks were given more CC and often less damage, trying to enforce the theme of tanks being frontline team fighters with strong teamfighting ultimates and disruptive kits. For example, Sejuani's old W used to be more of a Sunfire-esque effect that you would use to burn away at the enemy slowly in a similar manner to Lilia, and was much more heavily tied to slows to run people down like an Olaf Q or Nasus W. Maokai is another good example, where his old ult and E were changed to have much more CC and less consistent damage presence, pushing him more into that frontline teamfight presence idea they wanted. And just like Enchanters and Assassins, part of this issue is tied to the items, like what I talked about in the Laners and Scalers video regarding Assassin items and CDR power creeping consistency and attack speed, but tanks are a bit more of a unique case when it comes to this, because if you'll notice, most of the tanks we have today are all based on ability power, and for good reason. The reason is because AP used to actually have real support for AP fighters with old items specifically tailored for AP fighters like Sejuani, but with the magifying of AP for various reasons that I'll probably talk about in the next video, it left all of those AP fighters in a very weird spot where they kind of just lost their itemization, which was then solved by just pushing them into the aforementioned tank playstyle, where rather than tank items being to support a playstyle and that freedom of choice, they began to be seen as the tank classes items. So then how can we fix this? Well, as you probably thought throughout the video, the simple solution is to redistribute the power into more open-endedness, pushing the champions back into being more blank canvases that the player can then choose how to paint by using the item system. For example, taking away Assassin's front-loaded power in favor of re-fighterifying them, taking away Enchanters' supportive effects in favor of more solo lane power, and taking away Tanks' CC in favor of giving them back some of their more consistent damage. And this idea will then go hand in hand with the next video I'm planning, which will most likely come out tomorrow. This is based on the stats and item system, following up on that idea of making champions less specific and more properly defining the items as the current idea of classes, supporting more playstyles and player creativity based on the items having a specific balance. So subscribe if you want, leave a like if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.